Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist, The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. It's become conventional wisdom among the halls of the US government that China will launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan within the next few years. Speaking to the Washington Post on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Chief Navy Admiral Samuel Papero described the U.S. military's contingency plan for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan as flooding the narrow Taiwan Strait with swarms of thousands upon thousands of drones by land, sea, and air to delay a Chinese attack long enough for the U.S. and its allies to muster additional military assets in the region. Quote, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities, Papero said, so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me the time I need for everything else. Walter, a great wall of drones. Is this news or faux news?
News, but complicated news. First of all, let's just say that anytime something about China becomes conventional wisdom in Washington, it's probably wrong. So, given our track record, I would have to assume that if conventional wisdom now is now confident that's going to invade in within a few years, maybe that invasion could take a little longer. Who knows? But also, I think we should say Papero, who is really one of the sharpest admirals that we've got, is when he thinks about a hellscape, he's not just thinking about drones. The U.S. has some really interesting submarine capabilities, and we seem to spend a lot of time trying to just sort of remind the Chinese just how effective these things can be and how they can pop up where you don't think they are. So, but adding drones to that would be great. And obviously, one of the biggest lessons of the Ukraine war, besides the very old lesson of don't have a border with Russia if you want to have a quiet life, is that the drones in the against the Russian fleet on the Black Sea have been very effective. The Russian fleet has been bottled up. It's been forced really to flee the Crimea and kind of hide out way in a maritime corner that is harder for the Ukrainians to get at. And as far as using the fleet for the kinds of things that China would want to do, crossing 110 miles of Taiwan Strait and bringing a big invasion force with you, the Russians, at least against Ukraine, which is likely to be a weaker military power than the U.S. and Taiwan combined, with maybe an assist from Japan. It's interesting then that the Chinese have to be thinking, this does not look so easy. But this gets us to a whole nother layer here, which is that it turns out the U.S. might want to produce a hellscape of drones over the South China Sea, but it's not entirely clear that we can, or also that China couldn't build an even more hellish fleet of anti-drone drones. Now, it turns out that China, as it has with solar panels and EVs, has kind of stolen a march on the rest of the world when it comes to drone manufacturing. This is really a technology that the U.S. Kind of pioneered on drones, and the Chinese, with their sort of industrial capability, have are able to now produce a lot more of these things than we are, and especially the kind of cheap, fast ones, which is what you want when you're thinking about clouds and swarms of drones. So to match China, we're not only going to have to sort of produce a lot of drones, but we're actually going to have to work in different ways, because our whole procurement system is kind of is oriented towards doing really big deals with really big companies for really complex and expensive pieces of equipment. And by the way, and making sure when you do that, that the jobs that go into assembling these things are very neatly divided among the congressional districts and states of the people who sit on the appropriations and defense committees. It's a horrible, an utterly irresponsible way to run the defense of a great nation, but we've been doing this for quite a while. Where I come out at on this is that it reminds us that with a rapidly, especially in times like this, where you have a rapidly changing technological basis to defense and to warfare, adaptation is a key element of international competition. You know, can we reform our systems fast enough so that when we have a clear military need like this and a clear project, we can actually deliver? And this is not a technologically complex process. And these are not sort of cutting edge high tech drones that we're talking about. These are sort of run of the mill drones. But can we really make a lot of these fast enough? Can we reform the Pentagon fast enough? Will Congress sort of, give up some of the sort of cushy little trade-offs that Congress people enjoy? Now, in saying this, China also has some issues. China is locked into an economic model that clearly isn't working. They've known it can't go on for 15 or 20 years. So far, they haven't been able to break out of it, and the sort of consequences are continuing to proliferate across the Chinese economy. So you have sort of two lumbering behemoths here. And I suppose it's like sumo wrestlers or something. And the question is one of us still flexible and deft enough to get in a fast move?
Do you get the sense that the emphasis on unmanned weapon systems is mostly about what's militarily most effective these days? Or is this kind of a recognition that if the US is going to be able to defend a territory so far away and so close to mainland China, we're going to have to find a way to do it that doesn't involve troop deployments of, hundreds of thousands of Americans like we've had to do in the past?
I would say this. I'd say it's very convenient for the United States of America and our allies that just at the time we are forced into a sort of complex competition with one of the two most populous countries on the earth, it's very convenient that at this particular moment, technology is making manpower less of a factor in warfare. It's not a factor in warfare. Ask the Ukrainians, ask the Russians. But it is less of a critical issue. And so, yes, it enables us with technology. We can, to some degree, offset the disadvantages of distance. It works for us as the party with the smaller population and the greatest distance. Not the first time, by the way. During the Cold War, essentially our strategy, now the Soviet Union, people forget, the Soviet Union actually had a bigger population than the United States at the time of the Cold War. And, we really could not maintain military forces in Europe that were equal in size to those of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. And so we always had fewer tanks, fewer soldiers, but we had better ones. And we relied on technology to offset the greater mass. Now, China is coming at us with high technology as well as a large mass. But even so, I think there's some ways that if we are clever, if we are deft and agile, we should be able to offset their advantages.
All right, our second story. Democrats rushed to defend Kamala Harris's newly unveiled economic plans this week amid criticism that they amounted to gimmicks that would fail to tackle inflation. Harris outlined her economic vision at an event in North Carolina on Friday, pledging to ban price gouging, taxes on tipping, and offering cash to first-time homebuyers. But some of the measures met a cool response from economists and habitual allies of Democrats, complicating the vice president's bid to win voters' trust on the economy and cost of living issues. An ABC News Washington Post poll taken last week and released on Sunday showed Harris enjoying a 6-point lead over former President Donald Trump, but the same poll still put Trump 9 points ahead of Harris when it came to who voters trust more on the economy and inflation. Walter, news or faux news?
In one sense, it's faux news. I mean, you can't be surprised that when you bring a completely half-baked, gimmicky set of bad ideas to what many voters consider as the most important issue in the election, and where you're essentially dealing with the problem inflation that to some degree is related to the initiatives that the Biden administration has previously taken, people are naturally going to be very curious about what you're doing, and they want to hear that you got some good ideas. So, do a bad thing and, touch a hot stove and you burn your fingers. And again, she should be very, very thankful at the moment she's a Democrat, because what she's getting is muted grumbling and sort of more in sorrow than in anger and so on. Had she been a Republican, oh, the furies of hell would have come out. Talk about a swarm of killer drones over the South China Sea. What our media friends would have wielded against her. But she's a Democrat, so she's just getting her wrist lightly slapped. It's more of a lost opportunity. So on all of those things, I'd say not faux news, but the one piece that is news is that she and her team made this mistake on what is a high-profile issue. That, I think, tells us that they're still trying to figure it out in there. But getting a clear message on the economy is not some sort of minor thing that she needs to do. It's almost like when Jeb Bush was asked, what about the war in Iraq in the 2016 Republican? This was a question that you knew you were going to be asked, and it was a question whose answer would be very important to the future of your campaign. So it was news when he didn't immediately have a fantastic answer to that question. It's news that she does not immediately have a fantastic answer on the economy.
All right, final story of the week. The Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, a new German party named for its founder, a charismatic MP and former communist, is an offshoot from a hard left party that blends leftist economics with conservative positions on culture. Crucially for the state of Saxony, as well as Thuringia and Brandenburg, all of which vote next month, the new party has a dovish line on Russia that, when Wagenknecht turns on the demagogy, can be hard to distinguish from Kremlin propaganda. As campaigning heats up, Wagenknecht is making the political weather, according to The Economist. Her party is polling in double figures in the 3 voting states, while the hard-right Alternative for Germany, another pro-Russia party, could come first in all 3 states. But because it is shunned by every other party, Wagenknecht has a good chance of entering government in Saxony and elsewhere. She's already laying down conditions for potential coalition partners. They must echo her call for negotiations to end the Ukraine war and reject the federal government's recent agreement to station American missiles in Germany after 2026. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, first of all, Jeremy, let's all be completely clear on this. The only reason you're bringing this up is because you want the whole world to know that you can say Wagenknecht. All that time in Berlin has really paid off, and you can say Geschwindigkeitsgrenze, and you can just do all that fancy German stuff.
I have not actually yet heard what the appropriate American pronunciation of her name is. I don't think anyone's tried yet.
That's even worse. Somebody comes back from several years away and they say, what's the word in English? How do the Americans pronounce it? Well, I remember hearing the story that the wall came down and the East Germans were dancing in the streets, and they were shouting to the West Germans, "Wir sind ein Volk," we are one people. And they found out later the West Germans were going, "Uns auch," we are too. We're also one people on our side. And it is really interesting that more than 30 years after political unification, the 2 Germanys are very different. It looks like we will have majorities in several of these states for parties that reject the fundamental elements of the German Constitution, not to mention the Western Alliance. And I think we should also point out, and these parties are bitterly anti-American, both of them, that this is not some kind of, as I'm sure there's some people who would like to sort of say, oh, this is like the Trumpist wing of Germany. These people hate the United States of America. And since their grandparents were educated under their great-grandparents under Kaiser Wilhelm, their grandparents under Hitler, their parents under the communists. So for basically over a century, a steady diet of anti-American propaganda. It's really baked into the cake. And for many of them, it's anti-capitalist, anti-business as well. So it's an ugly mix. I'm glad I'm glad it's in somebody else's country and not ours. We have enough problems over here. And it is going to be a big problem. Less, I think, these state elections. I mean, German states, they're like our states. They have power, and Mississippi passes laws and Texas passes laws and Michigan passes laws, and they have a lot to do with schools and housing and stuff like that. But Michigan doesn't invade Canada. The issue is going to come at the next federal election. And will these, the German political system is really fragmented right now, where you can't get a majority without having three very different parties. So you have the Social Democrats and the Greens and the Free Democrats who all hate each other and all see each other as rivals and really don't agree on very much, except they'd rather be in office than out of office. And Germany is it's a country that a meteor is coming to Germany. The Chinese are going after German manufacturing, and they've figured out how to do it. The shift from internal combustion engines to EVs destroys Germany's greatest industry, where Germany has well over a century of making really, really good cars that get better and better, beautifully engineered, a joy to drive. Everyone sort of recognizes them as the gold standard. But EVs are so different from internal combustion engines that the global shift, which of course the Germans have pushed, the global shift to EVs destroys, nullifies that competitive advantage. If you add to that the higher energy costs that they're faced because of their various somewhat harebrained green initiatives, and the sort of high wages that the German model imposes and high taxes, it's not easy to see how Germany keeps making a living the way it's been doing. And they've tended to fight all the digitization and the move toward kind of the new kind of service economy that we're seeing. So the next German government has a lot to do. And now let's throw in Putin attacking his neighbors, where Germany has a kind of inescapable responsibility that Germany's approach is really going to shape what Europe can and can't do at a time when the US, whether it's Harris or Trump, is probably going to be less focused on bailing out Europe. So they're going to need a government. If these two parties make significant gains in the federal election, it becomes mathematically impossible to get a coalition that doesn't include virtually all, basically bring the Christian Democrats and the CSU into some kind of coalition. Those people will agree on nothing, and nothing will be what Germany does. This is not a time when either Europe, the free world, or suffering humanity can actually, accept Germany taking itself out of the game. But that's where it looks like it's headed.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So you wrote this week, Walter, quote, "Although Jacksonian national populism and Jeffersonian isolationism have their legitimate place in American foreign policy debates, neither can fully address today's challenges. Another historical school of U.S. foreign policy, Hamiltonian pragmatism, is better suited to the crises of the contemporary world. Based on the political philosophy of Alexander Hamilton, the founding father and first Secretary of the Treasury, this school offers a grand strategy that actively promotes U.S. commerce, American patriotism, and enlightened realism in foreign affairs. The Hamiltonian school lost its way in the end-of-history optimism of the early post-Cold War era, but the pressures of a more sober era in world history are leading to a rediscovery of the foundational ideas that make the Hamiltonian tradition an essential component of successful American foreign policy. So, Walter, I don't think we've actually ever talked about it before somehow. So, tell us what Hamiltonianism is and why you think it might be the better guide for the future as opposed to Jacksonianism, Jeffersonianism, or Wilsonianism.
Okay, well, first of all, I should probably start with some of our more alert audience members may have noticed that there's a gator on my shirt. That is the emblem of the University of Florida in Gainesville, where I'm shifting my professorship from Bard to U Florida. And actually, I'm going to be the Alexander Hamilton Professor of Strategy and Statecraft at the Hamilton Center. So it's this is maybe just a commercial to some degree, advertising my wares. But Alexander Hamilton really was an interesting guy. And you're referring, obviously, to the piece that's running in Foreign Affairs, the current issue of Foreign Affairs. One of the stories I really like about him was that as a young man, he wanted to go to Princeton. He was almost a penniless immigrant, basically, wanted to go to Princeton. Princeton would not admit him, and as we would say now, with all of the credits that he felt he should have. And so he went to Columbia instead, King's College then, it was called, went to Columbia. And then during the Revolution, he came back to Princeton as an artillery officer and shelled Nassau Hall. And I think that's, these days, Columbia students seem to be wanting to shell their own university, but in the old days, they went out there and they shelled other people's. And I would say to a lot of students that might be the better way to think. More, you could show your affection for your alma mater basically by going and rioting on someone else's campus. Anyway, Hamilton looked around the world. Here's America suddenly independent. So how are we gonna manage our affairs? And he said, well, what's the most successful country in the world? And it was actually looked fairly obvious at the time, even though they just lost the Revolutionary War, it was Great Britain. It had the highest, so we would say today, per capita GDP in the world. Outside of the United States, it clearly had the sort of most evolved form of representative government. It had a system of law that Americans really felt was, the best system of law. It was in many ways, it was the scientific leader of the day. It was the leader in trade. It was sort of on the road to dominating the history of the next 100 years. And so Hamilton thought, well, learn from success. Don't study the losers like Thomas Jefferson looking at the French. Study the winners. And okay, how did Britain do it? And here Hamilton really, I think, came up with some insights that historians and all still find pretty valid today. First of all, they had the Bank of England, which was essentially an independent central bank that helped manage the debt of the country in a way that sort of turned the national debt into a national asset, because the Bank of England would sell bonds to people, and these were considered really safe investments. And if you had a bunch of bonds from the Bank of England in your portfolio, you could use that as essentially collateral for a loan to private enterprise. So, or to buy a house or whatever you wanted to do. So that instead of government debt, again, well managed, prudently financed government debt, sort of dragging the economy down, they actually found a way to make it a stabilizing, energizing factor. But more than this, so Hamilton wanted, the first bank of the United States, and he wanted a system of deep capital markets because he understood that having a sound financial system, having really strong capital markets, being attractive to foreign capital, bringing domestic capital into the national market, and so on. All of this powers the wealth with good laws, protection for private property, protection for intellectual property, all these things that then allow a country to develop, allow its economy to grow. That provides the wealth that you need to defend yourself. to have an army that's strong enough. They were, not so much worried particularly about the Native Americans in Hamilton's day, as the French and the British and the Spanish were still the biggest powers in the world, were still very active in North America at the time. And none of them really liked the infant United States all that much. So you need to have an army, and you need to have a navy that could protect your commerce around the world. So this idea that you build up the private economy in association with a strong national government, and that provides the wealth that supports your foreign policy and your national defense. That's kind of a key element in Hamiltonian statecraft. And there are other things that I think have been critical. One is that Hamilton was a believer in markets. He read Adam Smith and admired Adam Smith, but he did, he was not a sort of doctrinaire. He wasn't Ayn Rand, let's say. He had this, he saw that because the economy is critical to national strategy, it's a geopolitical and geostrategic issue, as well as kind of, doctrinaire market thinking. So, for example, today, a Hamiltonian wouldn't say, oh, we have to have free trade with China because anything else would be less efficient. A Hamiltonian would say, we got to have secure supply chains. And if that costs something, well, that's the cost of being free and being in control of your own destiny. And it's the job of the government to do it. Now, that would mean all the more reason that you need a lot of other good economic policies to offset the costs, right? But you think politically. You don't just think in terms of the dogmas of economic theory, but you believe in free markets. You believe that capitalism is the engine that makes your country survive, enables it to survive and flourish, and provides political and social stability, as well as economic growth and international security. So you have that. Then he had something that I think American elites, the people who'd traditionally been Hamiltonian in American society, sort of big business and finance and so on, they lost this at the end of the Cold War. Hamilton was a nationalist. He wasn't a xenophobe. He wasn't some kind of a jingo. He wasn't a nut, but he strongly believed that America was and needed to be a nation, and that Americans had a common citizenship. He wanted a federal government that would ultimately be more important than the state governments in terms of the identities of the American people. This is probably in part because he, unlike a lot of the founding fathers, he was an immigrant. And so he was not, he didn't think of himself as a South Carolinian or a Massachusettser, Massachusettsonian, whatever those people call themselves. A New Yorker. He saw himself, he saw America whole. And that was an important element of his thought. But after 1990, the fall of the Soviet Union, end of history, it's all globalism now, unipolar moment, which some people thought would be a unipolar eternity. It became unfashionable in the world of big business to say, this company is American and we fly the flag outside and the Pledge of Allegiance means a lot to me and I take pride in this. I was like, no. Maybe we had our historical origins in the United States, but we're a global company and we don't think, it's, oh no, perish the thought that we would think of American national interests when we're writing WTO rules or doing other things. So the idea was that somehow the category of the national interest got blended with developing this global system, which, honestly, if we could have a really well-run global system on these terms, might be very good for the United States. But we're not going to get that because, wake up call here, China cheats. Russia would rather destroy the system. And there are a lot of other countries with a lot of money, like Saudi Arabia and others, who, while they may not be out to destroy the system, are not going to be our partners in creating sort of a platonically perfect ideal of the sort of world system that Americans think about. So big business lost the plot of Hamiltonianism, it seems to me. And you could see this too, I think, in some of the Ivy League universities and other elite circles. People stopped thinking that you should raise your kids to be patriotic. It actually used to be, I'm talking about my own college here, Yale College, it sort of prided itself that Yale students were really patriotic. Though I do remember that William F. Buckley once said that the greatest example of anticlimax in the English language is for God, for country, and for Yale. Stories like Nathan Hale, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. I once had a student who asked to identify Nathan Hale on a test, gave his last words as, I regret that I have but one life to live. But we lost that. And Alexander Hamilton would have seen that as a problem not just because it leads to really stupid policy that can make your country weaker, make other countries dangerous enemies, and leave you scrambling to deal in a world that isn't working the way you thought it was going to work. But it also delegitimates business and wealth. I mean, if big American corporations don't think of themselves as Americans and don't feel that they have some ties of obligation to the rest of us, what use are they to us? Why should we help Alphabet if China is trying to destroy its business model? What is it to me if some American company's stock goes down because it's getting hit by unfair competition, if these are just global companies? And in fact, in this new world, business needs the American government to work in its corner. Otherwise, the EU, every time it gets upset, oh my goodness, we haven't developed any high-tech companies, they'll come up with their usual answer. Well, let's impose a bunch of outrageous fines on American high-tech companies. And if we can't make our own, we can maybe tax yours. American tech needs a good relationship with the government. And guess what? The American government, the American state needs good relations with tech. How are we going to build these drones that we need in the South China Sea? How are we going to stay ahead in this accelerating tech-driven arms race that could absolutely change the security picture globally within months? All right. So we need, as a nation, a strong tech sector. And in fact, that's one of our great advantages, is that we have one. That's a very Hamiltonian system where, the wealth that capitalism and innovation create both the technology and the wealth that we need to defend ourselves. So we've got to get back to this, without patriotism as a bond linking the corporate sector with the rest of the country, wealth, privilege, all of the things that make corporations possible, they lose their legitimacy. And you start getting people like your old friend Sarah Wagenknecht over there in Germany, hating capitalism, hating America, hating corporations, and wanting to confiscate everything. The other thing is that Hamiltonianism, I think it is a more restrained approach. And I'm using that word a little bit carefully here. I don't want to get myself, I'm not talking about the Quincy Institute. I'm talking about the Hamilton Center. Although I will say John Quincy Adams was much more of a Hamiltonian than people give him credit for. That was a really strange name for an institute, which basically is dedicated to overturning pretty much everything that John Quincy Adams cared about. Have any questions about that? Just find out why the state of Florida is part of the Union. Anyway, Hamiltonianism is realist in the sense that it knows that you got to play balance of power politics. It knows we're not going to create a perfect world order, that it knows that human rights are really nice, they're really good, And we would like more people to have more of them. But fundamentally, the first thing American foreign policy has to do is to secure America, to make sure that no single power can dominate Asia and use those resources against us, or Europe, or that our own hemisphere, that hostile foreign powers are not able to entrench themselves in our hemisphere and create local threats to us, which, by the way, has been happening on a fairly significant scale while various elements in the American foreign policy world were dreaming about, global institutions. And I forget who it was who first coined that wonderful phrase, globaloney. Hamiltonians are not big consumers of globaloney, even though they know America has global interests. So it's not isolationist, but it's not universalist. It does not say, oh, we should just, we've got to be like evil Machiavellians and kill everybody we can as quickly as we can. And, let's like read Noam Chomsky as a how-to book for how to do American foreign policy. That's not how Hamiltonians think. But at the same time, they sort of, roll their eyes when they hear Wilsonians saying, the religious freedom in Turkmenistan, that's got to be the focus of our foreign policy. So it's a way, I think, of thinking concretely and pragmatically about the relationship between market capitalism, democratic politics and culture, and the American national interest in a dangerous world. We could probably use a little bit more of it.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. We know you're a fan of opera and a former longtime resident of New York, Walter, but speaking of Hamilton, do you have a favorite musical? You don't strike me as a show tunes person, but there's got to be at least one you'd recommend.
Actually, when I was a kid, my parents used to, and they had 4 kids, and we lived in a tiny house, and there was no air conditioning, and trying to get us all to go to sleep at night was not easy. So they would play records, to get us to go to sleep. And so we heard a lot of musicals as kids. So, My Fair Lady, could have danced all night, just great songs. Just last night with a friend, I watched Cabaret, which is a great musical. I'm not a big Sondheim fan. I'm more sort of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and of course Cole Porter, Anything Goes, some of those great old musicals. So there are some terrific musicals. If you're going to ask me, what's the best one? Boy, that is really hard. South Pacific, Jesus Christ Superstar, Cabaret, Oklahoma. There's a lot of them. So you're probably not going to find me in a piano bar singing, show tunes till 4:00 in the morning. But I don't run screaming from a room if somebody is putting on one of these musicals.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.